spectrum I identify kind of changes depending on the day. Um, but we're going to get into all of what that means as we get into our presentation. Now, a thing that you also do need to understand about me is I have ADHD, and I tend to ramble. So the slides that I have here are just as much to help me stay on track as they are to help everybody else learn things. So hopefully I don't wander too far off the topic, because any one of these things that we're going to get into today is something that I could absolutely go on talking about for hours and still have more to say. Because what we're going to go over today is what we'd call a 30,000-foot view. It's broad strokes, it's an overview of a lot of this stuff, but so many of these topics we're going to touch on are things that you could take multiple semester-long college-level courses on, because there's so much to know. So I've done my best to kind of put together some broad strokes to make it a little bit more accessible for people who might not know anything about all of this stuff, about modern gender theory. So I have for you a Gender 101. Concepts, terms, and etiquette for an ever-expanding gender landscape. Now, the ever-expanding gender landscape, a lot of people notice nowadays that, like, oh, there's so many more trans people than there used to be. And here's the thing. Some of you might be old enough to remember back in the day when you weren't allowed to be left-handed. When no matter what hand your brain actually wanted you to write with, you were taught to write with your right hand. Because left-handedness was seen as weird, and as if you were left-handed and you didn't learn how to use your right hand, then you were going to be at a disadvantage in the world. So people were forced to be right-handed. And then when we stopped forcing people to be right-handed and started accepting that people could be left-handed, wouldn't you know, you started seeing a lot more left-handed people in the world, because suddenly they were allowed to just be who they were, and they didn't have to try to force themselves to fit into a structure that they didn't fit into. That's kind of the same thing that's happening nowadays with gender. We're seeing so many more people coming out as transgender because we're at a point where people are finally starting to feel safe doing that. And that's so, so important. And we're, in this country at the moment, we're kind of at a little bit of a teetering point, where we've been working for a while on feeling safer, on helping people of different genders and different identities to feel safer being who they are. And now we're in danger of taking several steps backward. And that's why I think it's important to talk about this stuff and to educate people and let everyone know that, you know, being queer isn't something to be afraid of. That it's something beautiful and something that we can celebrate. And whether that is a queerness in terms of your sexual or romantic orientation, or in terms of your gender identity, or whatever, it's something to celebrate. So, in the interest of, you know, keeping things moving, I think we're gonna start off with a nice lighthearted topic. Gender, trauma, and deconstruction. So, I know that a lot of people might misunderstand what I mean when I say that it is inherently traumatic to be queer in this world. It's not because there's anything inherently traumatic about being queer. It's because the way that our society and our world is set up instills that trauma on us and doesn't really let us escape it. Everywhere you look, everything in our society is set up to assume that you are cisgender. We'll get into the definition of that later, but basically it means not trans. That you're a cisgender and that you are straight and you want to find a partner of the opposite sex and settle down and have a family and raise kids. And that's what our society is structured to assume. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, with wanting all that, with being that kind of person. That's just as beautiful as any other type of person. The issue is that for so long, that's kind of been the only option. It's been what's assumed as the default, and anything else is weird and sort of frowned upon. And it doesn't have to be. But when you grow up knowing that you're a little bit different, that that's not what you want from life, that's not who you are, but everything around you everywhere keeps telling you that that's what you're supposed to want, that's where the trauma comes in. So, trauma, some of you may know, doesn't have to be one big scary thing that happens to you. Sometimes it's a million tiny things over the course of years that build up and make you question everything that you know about yourself and make you so unsure of who you are. And that is how it becomes so traumatizing to grow up queer in this world. And that is also my way of explaining why, to be honest, I'm pretty anxious up here giving this talk today. Not because I'm afraid of any one of you individually or anything. The fact that you even agreed to come out to this talk to learn about this tells me that you want to understand, you want to be accepting and open-minded, and I appreciate that so much. But the trauma runs deep, and there's anxiety that comes from it. So if I seem like I'm nervous up here, it's because I am. But what we can do when we have something traumatic, some sort of social structure in our life that has caused us trauma, is we can enter a process called deconstruction. Deconstruction can take a lot of forms. What is deconstruction? A lot of people hear that word and hear that people are going through deconstruction over their religious upbringing or over their whatever social structures they've been brought up with, and they assume that that means that you're tearing it to pieces and throwing it away. And that's not what deconstruction is about. Deconstruction basically just means breaking down an idea. Not necessarily to destroy it, not to throw it away. My parents have arrived. Welcome. Yeah, someone is getting chairs for you. All right, so deconstruction is not about destroying an idea. It's not about destroying whatever social constructs you're trying to challenge. It's about breaking them down. It's about taking them apart to understand them. You take apart the idea, you take apart whatever structure this is, so you can understand how it works and see what parts of it are helpful and what parts of it you want to keep and love and embrace, and what parts are dragging you down and hurting you. That's what deconstruction is about. It can be a terrifying process, but it can also be very healing. To, look at how your life has been and everything that the culture you've grown up in, the society around you has told you has to be true. And to look at it and ask, does it though? Because a lot of the time, it doesn't have to be true. So, first thing we're going to get into for some very basics. This is one of the core concepts in gender theory, is that there is a difference between someone's gender and someone's sex. People very often think of those as being the same thing. They're not. They're not the same. they absolutely can be connected. And we will see how they can be and how they can be disconnected. So we're going to start with what someone's sex is. Someone's sex is their body. It's which end of the male to female spectrum their body falls on. And there are 4 main categories of traits that help determine someone's sex. First, their chromosomes. We all learned about this in probably middle school biology. And you probably learned that there are 2 ways that your sex chromosomes can be. You can either have 2 X chromosomes, and that makes you a woman, or you can have an X and a Y chromosome, and that makes you a man. Here's the thing. Even biological sex isn't a binary. It's also a spectrum. There are so many other ways that your chromosomes can be. The only one of those that are listed here that you can't actually survive and grow up to be a adult human is if you only have a Y chromosome and no X. There's too much happening on the X chromosome that's required for life. But any of these other options are things that people have. You can have XX, you can have XY. If you only have an X, then that's something called Turner syndrome. If you have 2 X's and a Y, that's something called Klinefelter syndrome. An X and 2 Y's is Jacob's syndrome, and 3 X's is trisomy X. Now, some of these do come with certain medical complications, but they are all valid ways that people can be. There are so many people in this world who don't even fall into what we think of as a binary with their chromosomes. It's in their very DNA. And there are absolutely people who grow up with one of these and have no extra medical symptoms and don't even know that they don't have one of the quote-unquote standard chromosome arrangements. So, that's the first category of characteristics that we can use to determine a biological sex. Second one is someone's hormone levels. We always learn that women have more estrogen and men have more testosterone. And I think you can probably pretty easily see how that's a spectrum as well. How much more estrogen? How much more testosterone? Your hormone levels are generally dictated by your chromosomes, but it's not always a nice, neat one-to-one. The next set of characteristics is what we call your primary sex characteristics. These are your reproductive organs. We also think of that as a binary. And it's not necessarily. There's spectrums everywhere. That's part of this deconstruction process, is realizing that almost everything in life that you think is a binary, unless it's literally a physical on-off switch, is probably actually a spectrum. And the 4th category is your secondary sex characteristics. These are the things that develop when you hit puberty. These are your facial hair or lack thereof. As your voice gets deeper, how far it drops when you hit puberty. It's the development of breasts, of body hair, of broader shoulders or broader hips. It is all of these things are your secondary sex characteristics. Now, here's the fun thing. Not only is each of these much more of a spectrum than it is a binary, but you can also just have one of the binary options for all of those and not have them be the same ones. Because, like I said, generally your hormones do dictate your chromosomes do dictate your hormone levels, generally, but biology is messy, and things get weird sometimes, you know? Sometimes your cells are incredibly complicated little machines, and sometimes they do things in ways that you don't expect. And as long as that's not preventing you from being able to be a happy and healthy human being, there's nothing wrong with it. If it is preventing you from being a happy and healthy human being, you should see your doctor. So, when we find that these traits do not align, we would call that person intersex. Now, intersex is another thing, like I talked about earlier, how we have so many more people nowadays identifying as transgender for the same reason that we saw more people being openly left-handed after we stopped punishing them for being left-handed. We do see more nowadays of people being open about being intersex. But there have always been intersex people. I forgot to look up this exact statistic, but I think it's something like approximately 1% of the population, which doesn't sound like a huge number until you realize that the population is 8 billion. So 1% is 80 million people. That's a lot of people. So, we've discussed what a biological sex is. Now, let's look at what a gender is. Because if your sex is dictated by your body, your gender is dictated by your brain. But when we look at someone's gender, we think of gender as a social construct. It's a social role. So if we think about how we identify someone, if you're just meeting someone new for the first time, how does your brain automatically categorize them as either a man or a woman? You can look at all kinds of characteristics. By the pitch of their voice, and by their speech mannerisms, by the clothes that they're wearing, whether or not they're wearing makeup and how that makeup is styled, by how their hair is styled, whether or not they have facial hair, even by their posture, the way they carry themselves. A lot of times, people who grow up female in this world learn subtly and subconsciously, just through looking at other women in the world, that there are specific ways that ladies are supposed to stand, and specific ways that ladies are supposed to walk and move. And if we go back a century or two, we get to finishing schools where they would specifically teach you these things explicitly. Nowadays, it's a lot more implicit, just through, like I said, watching other women in the world. And while I don't have the experience of growing up as a man in this world, I assume that there is some amount of that as well in that direction. But I would be willing to bet that it's not quite as dramatic. And the other way that we might identify a man or a woman is by their social role. And by what I mean by this is that, you know, if there is someone who you meet for the first time and you can't immediately tell if they're a man or a woman, but they're carrying a baby, which one would you be more likely to assume? Exactly. That's the kind of thing that I mean by a social role. If you can't immediately tell that someone is a man or a woman, but they come in wearing army fatigues, which one are you more likely to assume? Exactly. That's what I mean when I say gender is a social construct. Because it is a thing that our society, over thousands of years, gradually has built. An understanding of what women do and what men do. And there's been decades, even longer. You can go back centuries and find fantastic feminist speakers and thinkers and writers who have done so much of the deconstruction work on this for us. But a lot of times, what they're doing is trying to break down the rules that say women can't do this and men can't do that. And what I'm doing here is breaking down the rules that say you have to pick one. So, here's a fun little graphic that I made up for us. The gender identity spectrum. This is what we kind of tend to think of it as, especially when we're getting into understanding a little bit more about gender theory. We realize realize it's a spectrum. You know, feminine at one end, masculine at the other end, and people can be anywhere in between. And you can kind of think of it as a reverse bell curve, where a bell curve is like you only have a few at the extremes, and then in the middle you have almost everyone. This is sort of the opposite. Most people fall closer to one of the extremes, but there are people in the middle as well. It's just not quite as many. But here's one of those fun deconstruction moments where I'm going to challenge your ideas. What if the gender spectrum was more like that? This is a way that I like to think about gender. You have your feminine to masculine side of things, but you also have an axis for how strongly you identify as one or the other. So, someone who, say, was assigned female at birth, and grows up not really having any problem with that, but not really feeling very strong about it, might fall somewhere in here. Someone who is assigned male at birth and realizes at some point in their life that they very strongly feel that they are a woman might fall somewhere up here. There is a whole spectrum. There's a whole rainbow. We don't have to limit ourselves. And this is just my way of thinking about gender. The fascinating thing about it is that everybody kind of has their own unique way of thinking about it. I find this particularly useful, but I could probably come up with at least 2 or 3 more axes to add to this, but I only have 2 dimensions. But the more people you talk to about this, and the more open they can be about it, the more you'll discover that everybody has their own way of conceptualizing their gender. And this chart, if I were to show it to another person who, like me, was non-binary and knew some things about gender theory, they might look at it and say that doesn't make any sense to me, because they have a different way of conceptualizing it. Everyone's is unique. But generally speaking, for the most part, we do all tend to agree that at least there is more than one axis to the chart. It just depends how many more and what you want to label them. So, this is another thing that could be a spectrum all of its own. It could be another multi-axis chart like that, but I only made one, sorry. So, your gender identity versus your gender expression. And this is something that people often conflate as well, much like they often conflate gender and sex. Your gender identity is what you feel like you are. It's what you identify with. It's what you prefer to call yourself and prefer that other people call you. It is often connected to the name and pronouns that you choose to use, but not necessarily always. I know plenty of people who don't identify as male or female and still use their birth name even though it's a pretty strongly typically gendered name. It doesn't necessarily always line up, just like everything here, because it's complicated, because this is a thing about human psychology. We are all always more complicated than any of us think we are. So, the other side of this, gender expression, oh good, I'm glad that worked. Gender expression is how you express your gender. It's how you present your gender to the world. It's whether or not you choose to style yourself with traditional gender markers, like if you choose to, say, wear a dress, or you choose to wear a suit and tie. It's whether you choose to wear makeup, and whether you choose to continue speaking the way that you've always spoken, or make an effort to speak more effeminately or more masculinely. It's how you style your hair. It's all of these things. That's your gender expression. And just like everything else, these two don't always align. You may meet someone who loves to wear cute sundresses and fun makeup, but prefers to use they, them, or he, him pronouns. And the other way around is also true. You may find someone who prefers to, always wear pants, maybe if they have to go somewhere formal, a suit and tie, and keep their hair cropped short and never wear makeup or anything, and they still prefer to use she, her pronouns. Don't always align. And really, the whole point that I'm getting at with all of this is just you can't assume that you know someone's identity just based on what you see. The only way you can know someone's identity is by asking. So, now we're going to get to everyone's favorite part of any class, the vocab lesson. Now, I'm about to throw a whole bunch of vocab words at you. And to be honest, if all of you go home from here having learned a total of 2 new words from this list, I will consider that a win. But going through each of them will explain a lot of concepts that I think will be helpful. So don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz. But I think this will be helpful, even if you don't necessarily remember every term. Told you. So, we're going to start out right over here. Intersex. We talked about this one already. We mentioned it. That's just a person whose biological sex characteristics don't necessarily all align at the same end of the spectrum. Either they fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, or 2 different categories of them fall at 2 different ends of them. Because, again, biology's messy. And that's kind of fun. Next we have transgender, or trans for short. Basically, just what that means is that when you were born, you were assigned one of the binary genders, based likely on your reproductive organs. And at some point in your life, you realize that that's not the social role that you identify with, and that's not who you are. And so you might go through all kinds of things. You might change your name, you might change your pronouns, you might change your gender expression, you might change your appearance. You might take medical steps to alter your body to feel like it aligns more with who you know you are in your heart. But you might do none of those things. You might do only one of them. People have all kinds of different ways of relating to this concept. The other side of the coin from trans is cisgender, or cis. And all that means is that whatever gender you were assigned when you were born, you're still perfectly comfortable with that gender your whole life. And you'd never really feel a need to identify beyond that. And that's where, statistically speaking, the majority of people fall. And that's awesome. It's not me, though. So, next, we have gender dysphoria. Now, gender dysphoria is a lot of people's first sort of clue that they might be trans. Gender dysphoria is, well, dysphoria in general is just a deeply bad feeling. It's the opposite of euphoria. And it isn't extremely describable. It's just something causes you this intense, horrible feeling. And when it's gender dysphoria, it's usually related to something around your gender. You might realize one day that, like, you just kind of get uncomfortable every time someone says your name, or anytime someone uses gendered pronouns for you. Or maybe you realize that more and more as you grow up and your body develops that you hate looking in mirrors. Sorry, getting a phone call from work probably telling me that they're closed for tomorrow. They can leave a voicemail, I'll check it later. So, Dysphoria is that feeling that you get that something just isn't right. That something about your body or the way that you're addressed or referred to or the way that you're expected to dress and present yourself feels so wrong and just doesn't feel like you. And cis people can experience gender dysphoria as well. That's the fun secret. It doesn't necessarily, there can be like just some aspect of femininity that you just never liked and always made you feel weird, and you can still identify as a woman and just choose not to engage with that particular aspect of femininity. But trans people will usually start to notice it with one thing, and then it'll kind of, as soon as they start actually examining that thought and going through that whole deconstruction process, they'll start to realize that, oh, it's not just that one thing. It's all the things. Maybe there's another option for who I might be and how I might relate to my identity. So the other side of that coin is gender euphoria. Now, there's been a debate within the trans community that's been raging for decades about whether or not you have to experience gender dysphoria in order to be considered trans. Now, gender dysphoria is something that you will find in medical textbooks and in psychological textbooks. It's something that you will find in the DSM-5, which is the manual that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illnesses, because for a long time a lot of this was considered some sort of mental illness. And frankly, the fact that it's listed in the DSM-5 is the only reason why we can get insurance companies to cover any of the medical care or psychological care that we might need, either because we are trans or adjacent to that. As much as it sucks to have to clinicalize it and to treat it as a disorder, sometimes that's the only way that we can actually get the care and acceptance that we need. But gender euphoria is the opposite. And a lot of the conclusion that a lot of trans people have come to nowadays is that no, you don't necessarily need to experience gender dysphoria to identify as trans. It can be enough to try out a different gender identity and realize how much better that one makes you feel. You don't necessarily have to go through this horrible, intense depression over how you identify. It can be as simple as one day someone accidentally calls you by not the pronouns that you usually use, and you go, oh, I like that. Maybe I need to do some examination, and maybe that is more who I am. That can be a moment of gender euphoria. And that is a beautiful feeling when you find who you are and how you identify, and you find the identity that is comfortable for you, that finally makes you feel like yourself and feel free. That's what gender euphoria is. Next on our list, we have transition. Now, in this context, I'm sure all of you know what the word transition means just in general. In this context, transition can mean a few different things, but it's generally part of the process of a transgender person coming out of the closet and letting everybody in the world know who they are and not hiding anymore. So there's usually two main aspects of transition. There's social transition, which is just telling your friends and family, hey, I want to go by this different name now, and I have different pronouns. And I would love if you would all respect that. It's when if you're a person who was assigned female at birth, your social transition can be marked by the first time you go out and buy a nice, like, blazer that really makes you feel a little less effeminate. And if you were assigned male at birth, then it could be the first time you go out and buy yourself a skirt. These are all aspects of social transition. The other kind of transition is medical transition, and this is something that many but not all trans people will go through. And this is when you seek out medical interventions to help your body to align more with what your heart and brain feel. And there are several different surgical things. There's something we call HRT, which is short for hormone replacement therapy, which is basically getting supplemental hormones, because if you were assigned male at birth, then chances are you have more testosterone in your system. So if you later identify as a woman, or even just as not quite a man, you might seek out estrogen supplements to feminize your body a little bit. And there are all kinds of details of all the changes that you can go through with that, but I don't think we need to get into that one here. As I said, this is a 30,000-foot view, sort of a speech. But that's what, those are the two main aspects of transitioning, the social and the medical. And again, not every trans person is going to seek out medical interventions. It depends on the person and the circumstances of their life, and how they feel about themselves, and how available those things are to them. Next on our list, we have dead name. A person's dead name is if a person has decided at some point in their life to change their name. Their former name is called their dead name. And it is a little bit of a morbid term, yes. And that can be kind of loaded. It is the term that the community has landed on. Not everybody feels when they change their name like they need to bury their former name. Not everybody really feels that that name needs to be dead. It's just sort of become the name in kind of the same way that, like, we call really tall buildings skyscrapers, even though we know they don't really scrape the sky. Like, we call it the dead name because that's the name that we ended up with, even if we don't necessarily feel like our former name and our former self has to die and be buried. It's just the name that we landed on for it. All right, up next, non-binary. That's me. That is someone who identifies somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, somewhere that isn't at either the feminine or the masculine end, and is somewhere else. Non-binary is also an umbrella term. There are a lot of other identities that can fall under that term, and we'll get to a few of them over here. But non-binary is just a generic term that means someone who doesn't identify as male or as female. These next two kind of go together. Next two that I have on here are queer and LGBTQ+. Now, these two terms are often used interchangeably, and for good reason. They pretty much mean the same thing. And a lot of the difference between them is very nuanced stuff within the community. But I generally tend to prefer the term queer, because the term LGBTQ+, one, it's a mouthful. Two, the history of that term. Originally, what we would now call the LGBTQ+ community, or the queer community, was just called the gay community. And gay didn't exclusively mean a man who was attracted to other men. It meant anyone who we would now consider queer. And then at some point, there started to be a little bit of a shift where gay was a more masculine term, so we developed the term lesbian for women who are attracted to other women. So at that point, it went from being the gay community to being the GL community, gay and lesbian. Somewhere along the lines, I'm not actually sure which happened first, but somewhere along the lines, the G and the L swapped places, and also, we added the B, because somewhere in there, gay and lesbian started to take on connotations of a man who is only attracted to other men, and a woman who is only attracted to other women. And people started to realize, hey, that's not everyone. Some people are attracted to men and women. So we added B for bisexual. Then we had the LGB community. And you see how this goes on. Every time a new identity becomes identified and starts to really speak up for themselves, we have to add a new letter. Within the community, that initialism has become known affectionately as the alphabet soup. The furthest I have ever heard that expanded to is LGBTQQIAAP+. Also, sometimes people add 2S at the beginning of it for Two-Spirit people who are a Native American sort of gender identity. That's a lot more common in Canada for them to add that into the initialism. So it gets very unwieldy. Queer, that's an umbrella term. That includes all of us. That includes everybody who doesn't align with that standard expectation of you grow up as the gender that you were assigned at birth and you find a partner of the opposite sex and you settle down and have a family and have kids. Anybody really who doesn't quite identify with that, it could in some way be considered queer. And queerness is really mostly about challenging those boundaries. It's about challenging the boundaries that try to tell us how to love each other, how to love ourselves. That's what queerness is about, and that's something that even though the Q in this does stand for queer, the alphabet soup doesn't really cut it in trying to convey that. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. That is a fantastic question, and for the sake of the live stream, I will repeat it. I'm sorry, what's your name? Steve here has asked a very good question and has pointed out that in the past, at different points in the past, the word queer has had a negative connotation to it, a pejorative connotation. It has been used as what we would now consider a slur. And we're asking whether or not it's an appropriate word to use nowadays. And here's the thing. Queer was originally a term that was also used for the gay community back when that was what the gay community was called. And then at some point, the people who did not like that community started to take that term and use it offensively. And for a long time, that is how it was used. But back in the 80s and 90s, so before I was born, right up until my early childhood, there were a lot of queer activists who did a lot of work to reclaim that word and make it our word again. And there are people nowadays who still don't like to use it because they still feel like it's offensive. But and that's part of the nuance about the difference between LGBTQ plus versus queer, is that's a conversation that's been going on within the queer community for, again, decades. But really, we always want to keep the term positive, because if we just decide that, oh no, that's an offensive term again, then we're throwing away all the work that those activists in the 80s and 90s did. And we are basically taking something that was used as a weapon against us and that we have disarmed and defanged and claimed as our own, and then handing it back to the people who want to use it as a weapon against us again. So, for your question about whether or not it is appropriate for someone who is not part of the queer community to use the term, you're going to find differing opinions. I personally think it is. I also personally think it can come down to a question of tone. It can be pretty obvious when someone says the word queer, whether they mean it positively or neutrally, or whether they mean it as an insult. And that's a lot of what it comes down to. But if you're ever talking to someone who maybe you don't know very well and you're a little uncertain, it might be a little bit safer to use LGBT or LGBTQ plus or one of those variations. I personally am very, very on the train of let's make this word positive again and take away all the negative connotations, and that's just the name for what we are. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 That's fair. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for the live stream, that was we were asking about if, you are of that generation where you grew up hearing queer as an insult and you're not comfortable uh using the word queer now, what else can you use? And yes, the alphabet soup, as clunky as it is a safe choice. People generally won't be offended by it. If the issue with just using trans is that that's a subset of the community. Trans is people who it's specifically about their gender identity, whereas queer also includes people who are gay, people who are bi, people who are asexual, and people who their queerness comes from their orientation rather than their gender identity. And those are things that are not always aligned, just like everything else in this has been not always aligned. So if you want to talk specifically about the trans community, about people who don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, then absolutely, trans is a perfectly good term to use. But if you want to refer to the broader community and you're not comfortable with the word queer, which is perfectly valid, then I think the LGBTQ plus, as clunky as it is probably your safest choice. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is a very good point. And for the live stream, I'll reiterate that Kelly just brought up that also it feels very different to just say queer versus saying the queer community. And saying the queer community can feel a lot gentler and a lot more polite. And for some people, that might be the more comfortable term to use, is the queer community. Again, it's slightly longer, but I personally think it's less clunky than LGBTQ plus. So, getting back to the list because I don't want to keep you here all day, as much as I absolutely could. Over on this side, we have genderqueer, which basically means trans but kind of implies a less binary view. Genderqueer is how many non binary people will identify because, like non binary, it's just a very broad term. It basically means, hey, yes, I am queer, and what is queer about me is my gender. And that's what I'm focusing on right now, regardless of my orientation. You will find that a lot of these identity labels have very similar definitions to each other. You'll find that in orientations as well, but we're talking mostly about gender today. And one of those things, agender or genderless. Those are two terms that if you are not someone who identifies as one of them, you probably won't quite grasp the difference on an intuitive level. I don't grasp the difference on an intuitive level because I don't feel like I am either one of those. But from my understanding, you remember how we had the axis here of strongly identifying to not strongly identifying. To my understanding, someone who is agender is someone who strongly identifies as not having a gender, as not falling somewhere on that spectrum. Whereas genderless is someone who just doesn't really feel anything about their gender. And kind of doesn't really want to engage with the whole gender thing at all. And just, to me anyway, to my understanding, the difference between the two is more on how strongly you identify than anything else. But, like with everything else, you're gonna get slightly different definitions of those for every different person you ask. Now here's a term that I used earlier, gender expansive. And that just means inclusive of people who have genders other than cis man or cis woman. So you'll sometimes see things like, oh, this is a scholarship for gender expansive people. It's a catch-all term, much like non-binary or genderqueer, but it's even more generic. Because sometimes someone might say, identify as what we would call transfemme, but doesn't really want to call themselves a woman. It's someone who, instead of being all the way over here on the feminine side of the spectrum, is maybe more like here. If the middle was back here, they're like kind of here. They're on the feminine side, but not so far on that side that they actually want to call themselves a woman. It's a whole spectrum. The same goes for transmasc, but in the other direction. Someone who doesn't quite fully identify as a man, but does identify more on the masculine side of the spectrum. And those are the sorts of identities that don't necessarily always get caught by some of the broader umbrella terms like non-binary or genderqueer. And that's why we have a term like gender expansive. It just means of any genders beyond just the cis-binary genders. GNC, gender nonconforming. That one, like I said, so many of these are so similar. But that one basically means, regardless of what your identity is, your gender expression does not conform with whatever binary sex you are perceived to be. So, we might use the term gender nonconforming for, say, a drag queen who continues that persona beyond just the stage, but doesn't necessarily identify as a woman. You might use that term for a woman who just really hates dresses and really prefers to rock a blazer and a tie. You could consider that gender nonconforming. It's anything that doesn't conform with that strict binary structure that we've built. Gender fluid. Gender fluid is closer to how I identify, because gender fluid means that your gender is fluid. It's in flux. It changes depending on how you're feeling. There are some days where I wake up and I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling pretty femme today. I might put on some makeup. And there are some days when I wake up and I go, God, I wish I could grow a beard. Gender fluid it just means that you're changing. And it's hard to pin down. which is fun and also not fun in many ways. Third gender. Third gender is relatively self-explanatory, but it's a sort of generic term that we use for... There are a lot of cultures throughout the world and throughout history, other than ours, that have also had something beyond a gender binary. And we'll get into this a little bit more in another slide or two. It can be really sort of weird and difficult to try to apply our labels that we have now that evolved in our social context to other cultural contexts. So instead of saying, oh yes, several Native American nations have a non-binary identity and they call it Two-Spirit, well, there's a whole different cultural connotation of what Two-Spirit means versus what non-binary means. So as a generic term, we just say they have a third gender. There are some cultures that have more than three. That's not as common as having three, but there are some, certainly. This one here I've mentioned a couple times, assigned gender. That's just, when you were born, did the doctor say it's a girl or it's a boy? What did they write on your birth certificate? AFAB, sometimes pronounced as AFAB, means assigned female at birth. And AMAB, sometimes pronounced AMAB, means assigned male at birth. These are identifiers that queer people will sometimes share with each other, and that you'll share with your doctor, but that you don't necessarily need to share with everyone. Sometimes, with some people, it's a little more obvious. Those are usually people who haven't gone through quite as much transition. But, just like with everything, you should never assume, because maybe they're intersex. Maybe they have gone through some different aspects of transition that you're not familiar with. There's all kinds of reasons why, even if you look at someone and they, tell you they're a woman, but they have an Adam's apple and a beard, well, you can't necessarily always assume that that means that they were assigned male at birth either. There's all kinds of different people and different identities. Last one that I have on here is not necessarily specifically a gender-related term, it's just the term intersectionality. And intersectionality is an aspect of activism, and it comes up a lot in feminist talk, where we recognize that there's interplay between, say, being queer and being neurodivergent. And you're going to have a different unique life experience if you are trans and black than if you're trans and white. And you're going to have different life experiences if you are some sort of queer and poor, maybe even homeless, versus if you're queer and very well off. That's what we mean by intersectionality. It's just examining how the different factors intersect, and you can find sub-communities within those different things that can sometimes be very, very helpful for people. I also have, in the middle there, several pride flags, just because I like them. We have our general pride flag, sometimes called the intersectional pride flag, because nowadays it's not just the 6 rainbow colors, but we've added brown and black stripes to acknowledge the incredible work and effort on the part of people of color in forwarding our community and our rights and our ways of talking about ourselves. We have the 3 colors of the trans pride flag added because we wanted to acknowledge that nowadays trans people are being pretty well persecuted and having a pretty rough time, so we wanted to add a little extra recognition for them. And then we have here the yellow with the purple circle, which is the intersex pride flag. Then we have our trans pride flag. This is the non-binary pride flag. This is the bisexual pride flag, and this is the pansexual pride flag. And the difference between those is another very nuanced one, because bisexual originally meant attraction to both men and women, but has broadened to mean just attraction to more than one gender. But some of us feel like the word bisexual just doesn't really encompass it, because we're operating from outside of the gender binary, so why would we want our attraction to be labeled as being part of it? And that's what pansexual is for, which basically means attraction to people regardless of their gender, based on other characteristics, other qualifiers. There we go. These are a few outdated terms that you might still hear some people use. They were popular. They served their purposes, but we don't really use them anymore for various reasons. One is trans with the and that's why I wanted to bring them up, because people don't necessarily always know that those terms are outdated and that we don't really use them anymore within the community. The first one is, this one's kind of funny, trans with the asterisk after it, because it is outdated despite the fact that it first started getting used within the last decade. It only lasted a couple of years, and then we decided, actually, no, we don't want that one anymore. The asterisk was supposed to be, the reason we decided to stop using it is because the asterisk was supposed to stand for not just transgender, but also transsexual and transvestite, which are both outdated terms. And so we decided to abandon the asterisk thing because we realized that we don't really use the other terms that it was supposed to stand for anymore anyway. Transsexual is an outdated term that used to specifically refer to someone who has gone through some amount of medical transition, and we don't use that term anymore because, frankly, whether or not someone has gone through any medical gender transition is between them and their doctor. The average person that you meet in your life doesn't need to know that information. So we've stopped identifying people by that. And transvestite and crossdresser are synonyms, and we don't really use them anymore because we're trying to move into a world where a man wearing a dress isn't wearing women's clothing, he's wearing his dress. He's wearing a man's clothing because it's his clothing and he's a man. And a woman wearing, a bow tie and suspenders isn't wearing man's clothing, she's wearing woman's clothing. It's her clothing, she's a woman. And that's part of why we have abandoned those terms as well. So, I told you we'd get to this. Applying modern labels to historical people. It's a similar sort of thing as applying our culture's labels to other cultures, because you can look back at different cultures through time. So applying modern labels to historical people and why it doesn't always work. First, Alexander the Great of Macedon. You will hear from a lot of people that he was gay. Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah, he probably was, in fact, in as far as we can tell, romantically involved with a man. And in fact, as far as we can tell, his father at some point stole his boyfriend because the Greeks were wild. But in the context of ancient Greece, gay didn't really mean anything, because in the context of ancient Greece, they didn't think about sexuality as an orientation. There was no concept of sexual orientation. It was just people are attracted to other people, and if the person who you are attracted to happens to be the same sex as you, and they're also interested, well, have fun, but that's not who you're going to start a family with, because you can't have kids with them. It was, in fact, in ancient Rome, there was a saying that said that, I don't remember exactly, but it was something along the lines of, do your duty with women and have fun with men. It was just sort of assumed that everybody had this innate fluidness to their attraction, but that you were if you wanted to, be a responsible citizen and create more Romans, then you needed at some point to find a partner of the opposite sex to settle down with. So gay didn't really mean much of anything back in ancient Greece, so it doesn't really make sense to call Alexander the Great gay, because he probably was also attracted to women. Because when you really dig down into it, it turns out most people are not actually 100% straight. It's just that a lot of us, we've had it drilled into us so much by just the structures of our society, and our feelings for the same sex aren't that strong. So we just sort of abandon those feelings. Don't worry about them. Find someone of the opposite sex, settle down, have a family. But if you remove those structures and those assumptions, you end up discovering that human sexuality is a lot more fluid than people like to think. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable. That's part of the whole deconstruction process. Next we have Julie d'Aubigny, who was a 16th century French opera singer. And she was, if she lived nowadays, we might not call her a she. We might call her a they or a he. Or we might still call her a she and call her a lesbian or a bisexual person. But in her time, it was very common, if you were a woman who was attracted to women, that you would dress as a man to attract women. Nowadays, we would call that a form of gender expression. And nowadays, she might have identified as something other than she. But in the time, that was just what you did if you were attracted to the same sex. You dressed as the opposite sex to attract them. And it wasn't considered a different identity. So, in that context, it doesn't necessarily make sense to call someone trans or non-binary or gender fluid, because they didn't have those same constructs that we have nowadays. Next, we have, this one is a personal favorite of mine. This is the Public Universal Friend. I'm curious, has anybody here heard of the Public Universal Friend? No? Okay. So this part is slightly clumsy for me to talk about, just because the friend rejected all pronouns, and I will do my best to respect that, but that is a lot harder to do than just learning a new pronoun, is learning how to restructure your sentences so as to not use any pronouns. It's a whole thing. But the Public Universal Friend was a late 18th to early 19th century apocalyptic preacher who arose out of the Quaker tradition in New York State, and sort of toured around the northeast of the US. The friend, as a person, had gone through an experience earlier in the friend's life. The friend got sick, very sick, had a horrible fever, and almost died. But the friend survived. And the friend got sick before starting to identify as the Public Universal Friend. But after being sick and recovering, the friend described the experience of having had a vision of God's Spirit coming down upon the person that they were and taking over that person's body. And the friend believed themselves at this point to largely be a person who had died and who had been taken over by the Spirit of God. And that's who this person was now. The Public Universal Friend was someone who defied the gender binary and also defied the binary between human and divine, and defied the binary between life and death. This was a very religious experience and a very religious identity, which is not what we mean when we say genderless or agender nowadays. There was a deeply spiritual context to this. So, applying those modern labels, again, doesn't make a lot of sense. Here's one more that is gonna actually have a lot of the same explanation as Alexander the Great, but I couldn't resist putting it in just because I love the story so much. King David and Jonathan. If you read the first book of Samuel, I believe it's particularly chapter 18, where the relationship between King David, this is before he was king, when Saul was still king, between David and Saul's son Jonathan. If you read the description of that relationship, that language is used nowhere else in the Bible to describe a platonic relationship. It is only ever used for romantic relationships, explicitly romantic relationships, and for David and Jonathan. We've all grown up with this assumption that people are straight by default, and that that's the correct way to do things. And many of us have also grown up with the assumption that God wants us to be straight, and therefore that Bible characters should be straight. But the first book of Samuel, like I said, I think it's chapter 18, specifically describes them bonding their souls together as partners. That's not language that you use for a couple of best buds, usually. But, again, we didn't have back then a concept of a gay orientation. We just had a concept of who you liked, who you didn't like, who you were attracted to. And sexuality was seen as a lot more fluid. So, I want to talk a little bit now about my own personal experiences. And this is not something necessarily that you're actually going to hear about from every queer person who gets up to talk to you and explain queerness. This is just something that I personally wanted to talk about. So I've told you that I identify as non-binary. I also more specifically identify as transmasc, as one of those people who's not so far to the end of the spectrum as to identify as a man, but feels a little bit more on the masculine side of the spectrum than the feminine side. Like I said, I have days where I'm feeling a little more femme. Every once in a while, I even put on a dress and feel nice about it. But those days are few and far between. I much more often feel much more masculine and feel much more like myself when I am dressed a little more masculinely and when I am treated a little more masculinely. Now, I still do use they, them pronouns. I don't really prefer he, him. That also just feels a little weird. It feels a little closer to the truth than she, her, but they, them is the one that fits for me, because I am more in the middle of the spectrum. But I first started to realize that I might not be cis when I was a teenager, as so many of us do. It's a very common time to start to realize that. Because as a teenager, you're starting to realize a lot about who you are as a person. You're starting to really form your identity. And you also go through puberty and all of those changes that suddenly make your body feel like it's very much on one side of the spectrum or the other that you didn't have to deal with when you were a kid. But for me, it wasn't about my body. The first thing that made me kind of consider that I might not be cis was that I started to get really uncomfortable when people called me by my name. And it just really felt like it didn't fit. And like it just wasn't me. And it just didn't feel good. And as I started to explore that more, I started to discover more and more things. Like I said earlier, that sometimes you find that one thing that kind of makes you start to question it, and then you start to dig into it and discover more and more things that maybe aren't quite the way that you want them to be. And if that's the point in your life when you first learn about other gender identities and the fact that you actually have options. You don't have to just identify as whatever label someone gave you when you were born based on what genitalia you had. That can be a really freeing experience. And that was around when I started to learn a lot of this stuff. And I went through a few different labels that I tried out for a while. And that's also pretty common for trans people and non-binary people and people, gender expansive people, is to have to kind of cycle through a few of them before you find the one that fits. Which is part of where we get this whole concept of, oh, it's just a phase. Like, okay, it might be just a phase that I'm specifically using the label bigender, which means both genders. But it's not just a phase that I'm not a woman. That part is not just a phase. So I went through a few different labels before finally realizing that just like I don't have to pick between being a man or being a woman, I also don't actually have to pick a more specific label than non-binary. Non-binary is an umbrella term, but it fits. That's the one that fits best for how I feel. Because like I said, my identity changes sometimes, and it can be all over different parts of the spectrum, which does mean gender fluid also fits me, but I like to think of it more as just not being part of the binary. So the first thing that I did to socially transition in any kind of way was start using the name Max. And that's a name that I've been using since I was probably 20 or so. But I gradually, and for reference, that was 13 years ago. So I would gradually started wearing more masculine clothing and things like that. And eventually, it wasn't actually until my late 20s that I started using they, them pronouns. And here's a fun fact that I hope will make a lot of you feel better. I know a lot of you feel weird about they, them pronouns because it's so foreign, because so many of us were raised and taught in school that if you don't know someone's gender, you don't call them they, you call them he or she. Because they is plural. Here's the thing. The concept of they being used as a singular pronoun is older than the modern English language. Geoffrey Chaucer used singular they in his stories. So did Shakespeare. It's part of the English language, and it always has been. It's just something that a lot of people consider non-standard. But hey, if gender is a social construct, so is language. I promise you, all the words that we use were made up at some point. So, but here's the thing that I hope will make some of you feel better is that I was also raised like that. I went to Catholic schools growing up, and they were very, very firm about their grammar. And so in my adulthood, when I started considering that I might not be a she, it took me a while to get used to even saying they as a pronoun for a singular specific person. And actually the thing that I did to try to force myself to get a little bit more comfortable with it. Anybody here familiar with the game Dungeons and Dragons? Yeah? It's a great game. It's a role-playing game. For those of you who don't know, because I know my parents don't know much about it, for those of you who don't know, it's a role-playing game. You and your friends get together, and you each make up a character, and you have one person who makes up this whole world and story, and you get to tell a story together. And you have these rules about what your characters can and can't do in the story, and you get to roll dice to see how well you do it. And it's so much fun. It's just collective storytelling. That's all it is. You're playing make-believe, but there's numbers involved. So when I realized that I might want to try out they, them pronouns for myself, but that they still felt clunky for me to even say, I decided to play a character in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign who used they, them pronouns, because then I had a safe space to practice it, and where if I messed it up, I wasn't hurting any real person's feelings. I was hurting my character's feelings, and that's my character. They live in my head. It's okay. So even I had to practice with it a bit. It can be kind of clunky. But I did eventually get used to it and realize that, yeah, no, that fits way more comfortably than she ever did. So that's a little bit about my personal experience. Just so you guys all know a little bit about where I'm coming from. Now, next, here are some etiquette tips, some practical, actionable things that you can take home with you on how to be a good ally, how to be welcoming and accepting and supportive of the trans and or gender expansive people in your life. So we're going to start out with things to avoid. This one's pretty obvious. If someone has told you what their pronouns are, what their name is, use them. You should avoid using the wrong name and or pronouns after you've already been told the correct ones. So someone who, you've known your whole life might take a little while to get used to it, but you should at least make the effort. That's something to avoid. It's not, an immediate, you're a bad person if you mess it up. It's, just try. Just do your best. This one's one that people trip up on a lot. Avoid making a big show of apologizing if you do make a mistake with someone's name or pronouns. When you're talking to someone and you call them the wrong name, you call them the wrong pronoun, and they correct you, all you have to do is just stop, say sorry, and move on. If you stop to make a whole big show of apologizing, then you're taking what was a maybe slightly uncomfortable moment and turning it into a whole thing. It doesn't have to be a whole thing. It can be as simple as, no, actually, I use they, them pronouns. Oh, I'm sorry, they did that the other day. That's all it has to be. This one is also important. Avoid getting defensive if someone corrects you about someone's name or pronouns, whether it's theirs or someone else's. I know that's kind of an instinct that a lot of people have when they get corrected to get defensive. I know that's an instinct that I have that I'm working on because it's not a healthy instinct. And when someone, I can't speak for everyone, but at least for me, when I correct someone because they used the wrong name or pronouns for someone, whether it was for me or for someone else, I'm not doing it angrily. I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just gentle reminder. These are the pronouns you should be using. And we can move on. That's it. Because the only way that people learn is by being reminded. Next. Avoid asking about someone's dead name or about their assigned gender. You don't necessarily need to know someone's dead name. The only reason you might need to know someone's dead name is if they haven't legally changed their name yet, like me, and you're writing them a paycheck or something like that, or dealing with anything where you need to have the person's legal name. Otherwise, you don't need to know a person's dead name. If they're choosing not to use that name anymore, it's because they feel that that name doesn't represent them anymore. So you're asking them to tell you, oh, this is who I used to think I was, and not who I am now. And you also can avoid asking about someone's assigned gender, partially for the same reason, but also partially because, think about it, the way that we assign genders at birth, the way that we assign genders to babies, is by what shape their genitals are. So if you're asking someone what their assigned gender was, you are basically asking you, hey, do you have a penis? That's not an appropriate thing to just ask someone. That's information that you might need to know if you're that person's doctor, and that you might need to know if you are in a relationship with them and imminently about to have sex with them. Outside of those contexts, you don't need to know that. Next, avoid sharing someone's dead name with other people if you know it. If you happen to know someone's dead name because you knew them before they transitioned, some people kind of tend to think of that as like, oh, I know a secret little piece of trivia. It's like, okay, yeah, you know a secret little piece of trivia about the person that I'm not. There's no need to share that. You might as well just be telling people that I'm a different person than I am, because that's who I used to be or used to think I was. And this one can get a little bit tricky. You should also avoid outing someone who might not be ready to share their identity with everyone yet. So, if you meet someone and that person shares their gender identity with you, and you have any reason at all to believe that that might not be public information, that they might be telling you that in confidence, just ask them. Ask, hey, is this just between you and me, or are you out to everybody? Because if it is something they're telling you in confidence, you don't want to then go tell the blab to the whole world, hey, so-and-so is thinking about changing their gender identity, when they're not ready to talk about that with everyone yet. So, that one, if you're unsure, just ask. If you're meeting someone for the first time and they tell you their name and pronouns, and you perceive that maybe that might mean that they are trans, it's probably safe to assume that they are out, because they probably wouldn't be telling someone who they're just meeting for the first time if they aren't. But again, if you have any reason to doubt that, always better to ask. Now here's some things you can do. Obviously, respect the name and pronouns that someone tells you they'd prefer. If I have a friend who, she's fantastic. She's this wonderful trans woman who sings with me in one of the many, many choirs that I sing in. And the name that she introduces herself by nowadays is Cicera. That's not the name that she told me when I first met her. But that's the name that she uses now. So, and the name that she told me when I first met her also wasn't her dead name. It was something that she was kind of using as an in-between, a placeholder until she found the right name. So, even though it's not the name she initially told me, I know that the name she prefers now is Cicera, so that's what I call her. Things to do. If someone corrects you on their name or pronouns, apologize, restate your sentence with the correct pronoun, and move on with the conversation. That restating the sentence with the correct pronoun part is important, and it's important for two reasons. One, it's important because it shows the person that you are trying, you are making the effort, and you are willing to try. The second reason it's important is because that's how your brain learns. Actually saying it out loud does so much more to keep that information in your brain than just hearing it and thinking it and going, okay, I'll do better next time. Actually restating the sentence with the correct name or correct pronouns in it is going to help your brain catch on to it so much faster. It's wild. You should correct other people when you hear them dead name or misgender someone. Stand up for the trans people in your life. Obviously, if they have told you their identity in confidence, you don't want to correct other people on it because you don't want to share that. But if you know that person is out and you hear someone use the wrong pronouns for them, just a quick little, hey, I'm pretty sure that person uses she, her. Just a little thing, a little correction can go a long way. Here's a thing that you can do to help people feel safe around you, is when you introduce yourself to someone new, if you're comfortable doing so, offer your pronouns. You know? Hi, nice to meet you. My name's Max. I use they, them pronouns. This lets them know how you want to be referred to. It lets them know that you are someone who it's safe to tell their pronouns to. It lets them know that you are welcoming and that is something that you care about, is how they prefer to be referred to. Now, not everybody is always comfortable doing that, and that's okay. But if you are comfortable doing that, it's a little step you can do to help other people feel more comfortable too. Use gender-inclusive language whenever you can. You walk into a room with a bunch of people who you at least instinctively sort of mentally categorize as women. You could walk into that room and say, "Hi, ladies," or you could walk into that room and say, "Hey, folks." One of those assumes the gender of everybody in the room. The other one includes everybody, regardless. This is a big thing actually in choirs, because traditionally, sopranos and altos are women, and tenors and basses are men. And it's been a big push in the choral world for a while to switch from saying, okay, the ladies sing this part, or I only want to hear the men here, to switching to the sopranos and altos sing this part, or the upper voices sing this part. Yeah, the trebles, and the lower voices, or the tenors and basses, sing this part. It's a little bit of a switch. That is one that I personally happen to be witnessing a lot because I'm a choral singer. But yeah, just whatever you can using gender-inclusive language. You'll actually hear a lot of people my age and younger who are part of the queer community nowadays using y'all, even though that's traditionally a very Southern thing. And it's because of because y'all means all. Because it is inclusive. Exactly. And it's kind of also become a queer thing to say y'all. But you don't have to be queer to use it. It's fun, it's silly, and it's inclusive. And also, frankly, in my personal opinion, the English language greatly suffers from not having a distinct second person plural pronoun, so we should just make y'all official, frankly. That, things like dude or guy or things like that are kind of a case by case basis. Some people take them as pretty gender neutral. I do. Some people take them as highly gendered. Those are terms that I tend to use pretty casually, but when I know that I am around my friends who are trans femme, I tend to avoid using them because I don't want to make them feel like I'm invalidating their gender identity. But also, if you're not sure, just ask a person, hey, is it okay if I call you dude, or would you prefer that I don't? You know? In any of those sorts of terms. You know, sometimes, honestly, I will sometimes, with my friends who are cis women, I'll start a conversation with, hey man, it's a casual thing, but if you're ever unsure with a term like that, just ask. But this is also things about, like, instead of brothers and sisters, you can say siblings. Instead of mothers and fathers, you can say parents. Instead of daughters and sons, you can say children. Instead of, this is a fun one, this has become very popular at Renaissance fairs. Instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, it's just good gentles all. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways that you can just be a little bit more gender inclusive in your language, in your day-to-day life. And just like with all the rest of this stuff, No one expects you to be perfect about it immediately. But it's something you can work on. And this is the last thing on this things to do list. Understand that everyone's gender experience is unique. And if someone specifically asks you personally to do something differently than what I've listed here, these are very general rules, but sometimes someone's unique gender experience, they want you to do something different. They want you to talk about them differently. Do your best to respect it. And with all of this stuff, again, no one expects you to be perfect at it immediately and never get it wrong. But you can try. That's really what it's about. Making the effort to show people that you care. And that they are safe and welcome. And that, at least on some level, you understand that they're maybe a little bit different than the structures of our society have told you they're allowed to be, and that that's okay. Because that is really what queerness is about celebrating those differences. It's about celebrating the diversity of people's experiences and of people's psychology. And it's about tearing down those structures that try to tell us how to love. So, well, that was my conclusion. So, open Q&A time. Thank you. Thank you so much. If anybody does have further questions, you're welcome to ask them now. If you think of questions later that you don't get to ask me now, my email address is in the parish directory. You are more than welcome to either send me an email or catch me some time when you see me here and ask me. But if there are any questions now, I will take them. I can make it available. It's not yet, but it can be. It does not. But, okay. But this whole talk has been live streamed, and I believe that live stream will continue to live on our YouTube channel. So you should be able to find it there, and depending on how clearly the presentation, the slideshow, depending on how clearly visible it is in the live stream, I might provide it somewhere and have a link in the description so you can more clearly read the slides. Yes. Oh, that's delightful. It's not actually what it means. The question, for those who didn't hear it, was, does cis mean comfortable in skin? And that is very fun, but that's not where it comes from. It actually comes from chemistry. Because you, in chemistry, sometimes talk about chemicals that cross a boundary, and those are trans. They're going across. That's what trans means. And ones that don't cross a boundary are called cis. So, in fact, you could, if you think about the region Transylvania, that means across the forest. And once upon a time, they would have also talked about Cisylvania, on this side of the forest. That's what it means. It just means on this side, not crossing the boundary. But I do kind of love that, the idea that it means comfortable in skin. That's very fun. Oh, Urban Dictionary, what a place. All right. Do we have any other questions? Mm. Well, you can do what I did and play some Dungeons and Dragons. Or, and for the live stream, the question was any advice for people trying to employ they them pronouns more and trying to get used to it and when you're in conversation with someone and you might accidentally mess up and misgender them. And it's really just about practice. I also have an advantage in that I am neurodivergent. I have ADHD. My brain works a little bit differently, and that means that about half the time when I'm driving in my car, I'm listening to music, and the other half the time I am fully just out loud talking to myself. And that's a great time to practice things like that. But that really is all it is. It's just about practice. Mhm. Mhm. Well, the question was whether or not there are any resources that I can point people to towards deconstructing gender and exploring their own gender a little bit further. And there are tons. And what rather than give you specific ones, what I can tell you is that because everybody's gender experience is unique and everyone's going to have a little bit of a different journey, the best two things you can do are one, listen to yourself. Really get to know your own self and listen to what you find in there. And two, find as many different queer voices out there as you can, as many queer authors or speakers, YouTubers, TikTokers, as many queer people out there who are talking about this stuff as you can, because as many different opinions as you can get is what you're going to find the most helpful probably in finding your own experience. And you're gonna find a lot of opinions that are gonna differ from what I shared here, because everyone's experience is a little different. But I did try to keep it as generally broad as I could, so there probably won't be anything in there that gets fully contradicted. Just different people are going to have different takes, and that's part of what's going to help you find your take. Mhm. Do we have any other questions? Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Um Yeah, I didn't put speaker notes in there. The question was, is there a resource that people can go to have a just a concise place that has a lot of these terms explained? And the best one that I can think of off the top of my head is the website for the Human Rights Campaign, which I believe is just hrc.org. But if you Google search the Human Rights Campaign, you will find their website, and they have tons of resources about all sorts of queer identities, but also about a lot of different cultural identities and a lot of things about racism and a lot of that intersectionality that I talked about. But you will, in fact, that website is where I got the images of the pride flags because they do have a lot of that information listed there. There are plenty of other places, but that's the one I can think of off the top of my head that will probably be the most helpful. Thank you. All right. Well, if that is everything, then I think we can wrap up. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to everybody who was able to stay to the end. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who watched the live stream. And like I said, if you think of any questions later that you didn't think of now, you can either ask me when you see me here at church, or my email address is in the parish directory, and you are more than welcome to send me an email about it.